Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual meeting on justice-related congressional appropriations for COVID-19. This is the second in a series of meetings that we are hosting on justice responses to COVID-19. Each Wednesday, we will be covering a different portion of the system. My name is Allison Lawrence. I manage the Criminal Justice Reform portfolio for NCSL, and I also staff the Law, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety Committee. I will be your host today. There are also a number of NCSL staff on with us today that specialize in state and federal criminal justice policy. Please call on us anytime. We're here to provide you with assistance so you can be effective leaders in your states. Today you will hear about the impact that congressional appropriations for justice and Homeland Security programs have on you and your state. Both our speakers are based in NCSL's Washington, D.C. office and specialize in state-federal relations. Susan Frederick, NCSL's Senior Federal Affairs Counsel, will start off with an update on the status of federal stimulus bills and the political landscape going forward. She will also cover important congressional appropriations issues impacting criminal justice and cybersecurity. Lucia Bragg is Senior Policy Specialist, and we'll talk about the Federal Emergency Management Agency and small business disaster loans. We've reserved time at the end for questions that you've submitted throughout the meeting. And if we do not have time to address all the questions, we are saving the chat conversation and will respond afterwards. Next slide, please. I'm going to cover just a couple logistics before we dig into the meat. Karen McInnes is managing our controls. We currently have everyone on mute to ensure audio quality of the presenters. Amanda Essex on our team will be monitoring the chat box, so you'll see her name popping up. The chat box may be located on the right side of your screen, or you can easily access it by clicking on the word bubble symbol in your navigation bar. I encourage you to take advantage of the chat box function. Throughout the meeting, our speakers will be referencing various resources. Amanda will be dropping those links to those resources in the chat box for your viewing. Please also use the chat box to submit questions. You can submit them throughout the time. I'll be monitoring the questions and will reserve time at the end to make sure we can get to as many as possible. We have a resources page for this meeting. And you'll notice that that resources page is now a link to it's in your chat box. On that page, you can find these PowerPoint slides, some of the resources that will be in the chat box. And then after the meeting, we'll be adding additional resources that were mentioned, as well as a recording of the meeting. Bios for our speakers are also on that page. I'd now like to turn it over to Susan to start with the presentation today.
Hi, thank you, Allison, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this call. I'm going to give a lot of information here, so please, as you think of a question, please don't forget to put it in the chat box. I'm going to start with general stimulus bill activity, and as you know, states received $150 billion in the CARES Act, which was the third stimulus bill that was passed a few weeks ago. The Department of Treasury has been frantically putting out guidance on what that money can be used for. And one thing that we have verification of now is that it cannot be used retroactively to fill budget gaps. And I'll get back to that in a few minutes. So the next question then becomes, is there going to be a stimulus for? The answer is yes. And what's next? What can we expect to find in that next piece of legislation? Well, there's a couple of things that are floating around, and some of them are more sure bets than others. We know that Representative Nita Lowey, who is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, sent a memo to House Democrats stating that state and local aid, as well as flexibility, will be in the House version of the fourth stimulus bill. This amount could be as much as $1 trillion. We know that there is consideration being given to counties and cities in this next stimulus, that there will be equal pots of money for both county and city government, and every county and city would receive funds based on population. There would not be a population threshold as we saw in the third stimulus bill. Another fund, or another piece of information that's out is that there is a will in the House, at least, to provide another round of payments to Americans, like your stimulus check that you may have already received from the CARES Act. There is another round of that potentially coming. And financial assistance for both tribes and the United States Postal Service are also on the table for inclusion in the next stimulus bill. Some of the questions that have arisen as these discussions have taken place and are moving forward is, should this federal money be based on population or budget shortfall numbers? NCSL has no position on this, but we are gathering data on state budget shortfalls and hope to be able to produce that information for you all in the next couple of weeks. One of the things that we have heard and that the feds have basically kind of passed down to us is that small states that don't have as many COVID-19 expenses versus large states which have more COVID-19 expenses, there's a disparity in the funding that was awarded. The smaller states got a lot more from CARES and the Coronavirus Relief Fund, states like Alaska, Hawaii, Montana, and Wyoming, not so much New Jersey and New York with large numbers of cases and a large population. So I think that when the House considers their legislation, those are some of the balancing factors that will occur. The parties, as you may have been reading in the press, are divided on state and local aid, but as of this morning, and these things are moving very rapidly and changing kind of by the hour, so I've been completely updating this presentation as late as 1 p.m. Eastern time here. They seem to be coming around to agreeing that some sort of state and local aid needs to be a part of this next stimulus bill. NCSL and all other state and locality or local national associations are together on the flexibility and retroactivity issue. They have issued a joint statement, and our link will be posted in the chat box here. It's our Big 7 Flexible Relief Statement, and it basically calls upon the federal government to acknowledge that states are experiencing these budget shortfalls and need to be able to use the existing coronavirus relief fund money, which is $150 billion, to backfill some of those budget gaps that they are experiencing. NCSL has also issued a letter on its own priorities, our priorities. Our number for budget is $300 billion for states in fiscal relief, plus flexibility in the Stimulus 4 funds, and with the $150 billion in the CARES Act, the third stimulus funds. So that document, link to that is also posted. And in addition, states are weighing in. There is a leader's letter that was signed by the leaders of 15 states, and you can see that letter, the text of that letter as well, and basically asking for the same thing, acknowledging that there are budget shortfalls in our states, that states cannot conquer the economic issues without federal assistance, and that we are all in this together, as you've heard many times by now, and we need to work together, both state and federal government, to alleviate some of the bad economic downfall that we're experiencing right now in our country. I would now encourage you, because I am a lobbyist, to reach out to your state legislative leaders and your federal delegation to make a statement. Now is the time. The negotiations are ongoing, and this would be the perfect time to weigh in with your state's situation and what it is you believe that should be coming from the federal government. We hope you will acknowledge at least that there should be retroactivity and application of the $150 billion in the Coronavirus Relief Fund. But we urge you to do this now. This is a very important time when the negotiations are ongoing. The House is still out of session at the moment. They are supposed to come back next week. The Senate is here, but they are not doing a full slate of activities. So, and I know that they are negotiating on the fourth stimulus package. So what are the trade-offs to all of this? The president may give us a few clues. One of the things that he did was, in response to some of these reports coming out of the House and the Senate, that he would be agreeable to state and local aid if he could get a couple of things from Congress. And one of the things that he discussed was payroll taxes. That is a controversial issue. Some Republicans are not in favor of that on the Senate side. Most of the Democrats are not in favor of that. They would push for more stimulus checks coming to individuals rather than a payroll tax relief provision in the next stimulus bill. Capital gains taxes is on the table. And one of the biggest issues is the immunity for businesses if their employees become sick. So lawsuit indemnification and immunity is another issue. That will be a very difficult sell for the Democrats, but we'll have to see how the negotiations play out on that. It may be that the aid and the retroactivity is more important than the indemnification provisions. There may be some give and take there. So another issue that we've come across is that there's been a little bit of talk about, well, if we give states more money, will they then use that money to backfill or to help with pension issues that are a result of poor fiscal management on the part of the states? Most Republicans are not in favor of having any funding for coronavirus be used to deal with pension issues that may exist in your state. We feel that that's an easy thing to solve. They could certainly put in guardrails into the legislation to clarify that any stimulus funding could not be used to address state pension issues. One other thing that I will discuss very briefly, there's been a lot of, I guess, kerfluffle over the bankruptcy question. What's the deal with bankruptcy? That for states is nothing but a red herring. States are constitutionally prohibited from filing for bankruptcy. They cannot do it at the state level. Localities can. Think Detroit and Harrisburg as a result of the Great Depression back in the, or not the Great Depression, the Great Recession back in the 2000s, early or mid 2000s. Localities can file, states are constitutionally barred from filing, so that cannot occur. I won't say anything more about that, but I will go to the next slide. So that is kind of the situation with the general fiscal issues and this next stimulus bill and some of the conversations that have been happening here inside the Beltway amongst and between members of Congress. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the funding that we already have. And one of the areas that we haven't really talked about is the mental health grants through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. There are SAMHSA grants that occurred through the CARES Act. 31 states and 1 territory, as well as a host of tribal nations, have applied. And states have applied as well. So check with your state to see if you are one of the states that has actually submitted an application. The reason this is important is because it specifically mentions reentry and justice-involved populations as being eligible for this grant money under the CARES Act. It's $425 million for substance abuse and mental health services, and these programs will include behavioral, certified community behavioral health clinics, $50 million for suicide prevention programs, and $100 million for mental health and substance use disorder emergency grants. $4 billion for community health centers, which is $1.32 billion over current fiscal year 2020 funding levels. So this money can be used for incarcerated populations, which is why I bring it up, knowing that mental health and the incarcerated is a big issue for most states. The mental health community has weighed in, the advocacy groups, and they actually have 2 main asks for any future stimulus package, and I want to pass those along to you. Their first ask is to allow Medicaid to pay for health care provided to people who are re-entering society after incarceration. So that's an important piece you need to know that may be included in the next stimulus. This would allow Medicaid to pay for care for individuals who are incarcerated during the 30-day period preceding their release. As you know, prisons and jails are often the default providers for mental health services. And while many people who are incarcerated are eligible for Medicaid, under the Medicaid inmate exclusion policy, federal law prohibits Medicaid from excuse me, from financing the care of anyone committed to a jail, prison, detention center, or other penal facility. So that's one of their asks. The second ask is to provide resources for states to address the increased demand for mental health crisis support by creating a new crisis services set aside in the mental health block grant. So that would also beef up mental health hotlines, be a source of funding to help communities expand evidence-based crisis services, and so on. So that's an important piece to keep in mind that may be included in the next stimulus package. And we can go to the next slide. So I also wanted to mention burn JAG funding. There was $850 million in the CARES Act for burn JAG, and many of these grants have already gone out. One of the things that we have seen with this money in the CARES Act is that it's a very quick turnaround time. So once you have applied, the money goes out very, very quickly, sometimes as quickly as a week. So I would suggest that if you are unaware of whether your state has applied for its share of this CARES Act emergency funding, that you check with your SAA or your Department of Prisons to see whether they've gotten their application in. There is a lot of flexibility in the use of these funds. It can be used for a broad range of activities to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. Some of the projects, when you go on the BJA page and see what some of them look like, some of the projects are overtime equipment, including law enforcement and medical personal protective equipment, hiring, supplies such as gloves and masks and hand sanitizer, training, travel expenses, particularly related to the distribution of resources to the most impacted areas, technology solutions for courts, reentry, programs for jail diversion and pretrial needs, supervision under social distancing, and addressing the medical needs of inmates in state and local and tribal prisons and jails and detention centers. So very, very broad purposes. We are hoping to see more funding coming in the fourth stimulus, given that the number of cases in both local jails and state prisons has risen quite rapidly in some places. So we're hopeful that there will be a little more funding coming for some of that, perhaps under the Burn JAG program. Another bill I'd like to talk about, not so much an appropriations bill, but a substantive bill that is moving in the House right now, is this Relaunching America's Workforce Act, coming through the House Committee on Education and Labor. Its chief sponsor is Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia, who has long been a champion of criminal justice issues when he served on the House Judiciary Committee many years ago. He's since moved over to the House Committee on Education and Labor as its chair, but he continues to foster a great interest, and it's one of his priorities to kind of link education and criminal justice reform together. So this bill, its purpose is to provide additional flexibilities to state and local workforce systems in responding to COVID-19. And the reason I mention this is because it does have a provision in the bill that deals directly with reentry. And one of the things that I will talk about for just a moment here, it's got a literacy and reentry funding provision. So $350 million is contained in this bill to support justice-involved youth, young adults, formerly incarcerated adults, and former offenders during and following the COVID-19 pandemic. The money can be used for employment-related opportunities, including subsidizing employment, transitional jobs, and bolstering alignment with the workforce system. It also contains $1 billion to increase adult education and literacy for low-income and low-literacy adults, to move education and services online, and to increase digital literacy training. So that can also be an important component when we're looking at reentry issues and funding coming down from the federal level to support state activities. And we can go to the next slide. But one more thing I'll talk about with respect to this bill that I don't want to forget. The funds for the Relaunching America's Workforce Act will supplement, not supplant, state and local government funds in this area. So this will be money that you can use in addition to whatever your state has currently set aside for these purposes. Now I'm going to turn to some cybersecurity. I'm going to talk about the things on this slide in reverse order. I'm going to start with election security. So under the CARES Act, there was $400 million given to states in election security funding. And that includes vote by mail activities. If your state is moving toward that, you can use your share of the $400 million toward any vote by mail activities or beefing up your absentee balloting, etc. The thing about this, it does carry a 20% state match. So that's going to be a challenge, as we are now seeing for many states, to meet that 20% match threshold. And what we have been hearing back from state election officials is that this is clearly not going to be enough money to hold primaries and elections, even as far out as the November election, on this $400 million. There was a study that was just released by the Brennan Center, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the University of Pittsburgh Cybersecurity program, and the R Street Institute, so a bipartisan group of organizations. They picked 5 states to study. So they looked at Georgia, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And what they found was that the funding that was provided under the CARES Act doesn't even come to about 15% of what any of those states will need to hold an election. So for example, Georgia needs, or estimated that it needs, between $110 and $124 million to fully secure its election processes and to provide ballots, mail-in ballots or absentee ballots for every citizen who might need them. They only received $10.8 million out of that 110, which is the low end of their estimate. And the other states that were surveyed, pretty much the same thing. Michigan needs between 94 and 103 million. They only received 11.2 million. Missouri estimated it needs between 59 and 67 million, and it only received 7.6. Ohio, same story, 70 to 82 million estimated, only received 12.8. And Pennsylvania, estimated between 79 and 90 million, only received 14.2. So as the study shows, and you can see the link there, you can look at it and read it in more detail, the $400 million will only cover between 8 to 18% of what these 5 states need to run safe and secure elections. And most of that cost will actually be borne by the localities. So without funding from the federal government, this report concluded that there's not much chance that state and local governments can shoulder the financial burden of securing their election systems because of the budget shortfalls, and because elections usually does not rise to the top tier of funding at the state and local level. States are anticipating more requests for mail-in ballots, and there's going to be a greater need for that, as well as updating voter registrations online as opposed to in person. So lots of changing things. NCSL has asked for more funding for cybersecurity in the phase 4 stimulus, and we'd hope that states would use part of that funding for cyber to also use it to secure their elections in preparation for the November election. We did do a Big 7 letter on that particular issue, which is Big 7 means our state and local national associations that represent state and local government. So it's us, the governors, National Governors Association, the National League of Cities, the Council of State Governments, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the International City County Managers Association, and the National Association of Counties. So all of these groups were all united on that request. Some options that states are considering in this particularly strange time is delaying primary elections. At least 12 presidential preference and state primary elections have been moved to June the 2nd, which we're now kind of dubbing the second Super Tuesday. Absentee voting, Department of Justice advises don't lick the envelope because you don't know what's on it. Fraudulent clickbait is appearing, so be careful. If you are seeing something on your Facebook feed that says click here to vote, probably shouldn't do that. And vote by mail, a huge transition would be required. The Postal Service says it can handle it, but there's a lot more involved with transitioning from the traditional way your state runs elections to an all-mail, all vote by mail election. So I'm going to go back up to the top of that slide there to talk about this one particular case that is one of the first cybersecurity cases that we're seeing in the Supreme Court. This is a case that was accepted last week, and it's not often that cybersecurity makes it that far in the judicial system, but it's worth mentioning because this case involves the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which was done in 1986 and has never been amended. So this is a very old statute, and it doesn't reflect clearly our use of the internet. And one of the reasons why it is so important, without getting into the facts and the arguments, but the basic thing to remember about this case is that the folks that work for the FBI and that work for companies that do research on cybercrime and detecting fraudulent websites, misinformation, disinformation, and all of that, if this law applies narrowly, they will not be able to do, or they will not be able to do the research that they need to do to break into some of these fraudulent websites and find cyber criminals. And that's because what the CFAA does is it makes it a federal crime to either access a computer without authorization or to exceed the user's authorized access to obtain information. So it's applied very, very broadly. And the states are kind of conflicted, depending on where you are, as to whether that statute should be applied broadly or narrowly. So the use of these strategies that cybercrime folks that investigate this and research this and detect it may rise or fall on what the Supreme Court says the scope of that statute is. So one to keep an eye on in cybersecurity. And because we are talking about pandemic-related crime and pandemic-related money, just want to bring one more case to your attention. The first pandemic relief fraud case has now been reported from Rhode Island. And this was an instance where the defendants in this case are accused of seeking more than $500,000 in relief to pay employees at businesses that were either fictitious, closed, or owned by someone else. They allegedly lied on bank applications for loans from the Paycheck Protection Program, and their charges range from identity theft to bank fraud and conspiracy. So we are probably going to see more of this as we progress through these grants and loans and money coming out from the feds to individuals. Unfortunately, not everyone is an honest broker. So I would now like to turn the presentation over to Lucia Bragg. But before I do, I just want to remind you again to put all your questions in the chat box so that we can get to them at the end of our slides.
All right, thanks, Susan. I'm going to try and expedite my comments in the interest of time and to preserve some Q&A. So I'll just dive right in. I'm going to give a brief overview of the emergency management, small business assistance, and some immigration provisions in the recent coronavirus aid packages. So first, in the CARES Act, FEMA was appropriated $45 billion to the Disaster Relief Fund, which is housed under FEMA for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to aid in their COVID-19 response and recovery efforts. So reimbursable activities are detailed at length on FEMA's website, and we can certainly provide more information to folks on that, but they may include medical response, personal protective equipment, National Guard deployment, coordination of logistics, safety measures, and community services nationwide. $25 billion of that allocation was for states with major disaster declarations declared, but at this point, that includes everybody. So it's kind of a wash. So it's worth mentioning while we're on the subject of FEMA and legislative developments that, FEMA assistance is generally made available to states at a 25% state cost share, with FEMA covering the other 75%. So NCSL sent a letter to the House and Senate leadership, as well as a separate letter to FEMA Administrator Pete Gaynor, in the previous couple weeks, requesting a waiver of that state cost share for COVID-19 activities, which would amount to 100% federal coverage for that assistance. So we've worked closely with other groups in the Big Seven, as Susan mentioned, such as the National Governors Association, on this effort. And it's worth mentioning that, last Friday, actually, the COVID-19 Cost Share Adjustment Relief Act of 2020 was introduced by the chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Peter DeFazio, as well as the chair of the House Committee on Appropriations, Anita Lowy, and as well the chair of the House Committee on Homeland Security, Benny G. Thompson. So at this point, certainly a good amount of support from House leadership and Democrats, but NCSL is watching that bill closely and keeping an eye on whether and how bipartisan support will develop for it. So as well, it's worth mentioning, back to the CARES Act appropriations, that the Emergency Food and Shelter Program received an additional $200 million. Applications are due by May 29th from local boards. They can submit their plans to the national board under this program. And then, guidance documents with more details are going to be made available no later than this Friday, May 8th. And that funding is allocated by the national board under EFSP to qualifying local jurisdictions via formula. So it's also worth mentioning the emergency management performance grants, which I'm sure folks on the line might be familiar with. Those grants received an extra $100 million under the CARES Act. FEMA announced on April 14th a notice of funding opportunity for that additional $100 billion. The application deadline for that was April 28th. The funds are meant to support state and local emergency management offices in the COVID-19 response effort, at least the supplemental funds. This is separate and distinct from, any funding that was already awarded under the FY 2020 EMPG funding notice earlier this year. So it's worth noting, finally, for the CARES Act under emergency management, the Assistance to Firefighters grants received an additional supplemental $100 million. So funding for that is available to fire service organizations nationwide, with membership involved in the COVID-19 pandemic response for, things like personal protective equipment and supplies. Applications for that are due by May 15th. And the application is available through the FEMA Grants Outcomes application portal online, which we have a link to if folks want to follow up for that. So on my next slide, if we could advance, I'll cover the small business disaster loans very briefly. So folks might be familiar with the economic injury disaster loans and, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program. They're the two major sources of small business assistance for COVID-19. So under the CARES Act, $10 billion was appropriated for the EIDL loans, and $349 billion was appropriated for the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, as I'll refer to it. Funding then ran out because of the overwhelming response and applications for that funding. So then came the stimulus, 3.5, as we're calling it, which appropriated an additional $60 billion for the EIDL loans and $310 billion for the PPP program. Quickly, the EIDL program provides loans to small businesses up to $2 million. Applicants are automatically considered for up to $10,000 in grants as an advance that does not need to be repaid. And it's important to note that right now, and as a result of the stimulus 3.5, only agricultural businesses are being considered for the EIDL loans. I imagine, this is temporary, but there hasn't been like a, end date for that particular stipulation. So stimulus 3.5 clarified for both the EIDL program and the Paycheck Protection Program that farmers are eligible for these, which is a big development. The PPP eligible businesses include small businesses with fewer than 500 employees and select types of businesses with fewer than 1,500. Self-employed, sole proprietors, freelance, and gig economy workers are also included and eligible. And the amount of the loan, the maximum awards would be the lesser of $10 million or 2.5 times the average monthly payroll costs for the business. 75% of the loan must be used for payroll costs, and it is forgivable if the proceeds are used for any of the following costs. So payroll costs, rent on a lease, electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, internet, a lot of kind of overhead costs, group health insurance, etc. So for more information, more detail on that, NCSL put out a brief on the loan details for both of those and how to apply. So I really kind of recommend that resource and kind of refer folks to that for additional information. So a key detail, the reason why we bring it up for the criminal justice briefing is that a key detail for these programs is that, and a caveat is that businesses owned by formerly incarcerated individuals are either not eligible for these loans or their eligibility may be affected by that prior history. So for the PPP, the most recent guidance from SBA issued April 3rd disqualifies from financial assistance a small business if either of the following are true. An owner of 20% or more of the equity is currently subject to criminal charges, incarceration, probation, or parole, or any owner of the business who has in the last 5 years been convicted of any felony, pled guilty or no contest to felony charges, or been placed on pretrial, diversion, or any form of parole or probation, including a probation before judgment based on felony charges. So, for the EIDL, this picture is a little bit less clear, but the EIDL application does ask whether someone has ever been convicted, pled guilty, or been placed on any form of parole or probation. But it is unclear if answering yes to this question disqualifies the applicant or reduces their eligibility. So sort of keeping tabs on that for clarity as well. There's been some advocacy around this issue of note, and I will just note 2 letters that have gone out from different groups. So last week, U.S. Senator Rob Portman and Ben Cardin wrote a letter to the Treasury Secretary and Small Business Administration asking that small business owners with criminal records be considered and able to take advantage of these loans. Senator Cardin is the ranking member of the Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee. Also of note, a little bit earlier than that, on April 17th, a group of 19 nonprofit advocacy groups in the criminal justice space also wrote a letter to the Treasury Secretary and the Small Business Administration asking the same and outlining the exclusion as, quote, unnecessary, confusing, inconsistent with congressional intent, overboard, unfair, and discriminatory. So there's certainly been a lot of discussion about these stipulations, and it's something NCSL will continue to kind of keep tabs on. And if we can move on to my next slide, I will discuss some of the immigration provisions of note in some of these appropriations bills as well. So while the stimulus packages so far have not included specific appropriations for immigration-related purposes by and large, certain technicalities in the way that the assistance has been administered appears to leave out certain immigrant populations in certain circumstances. So the administration, has also taken steps to limit immigration procedures during the COVID-19 crisis, but we will discuss, that more in depth on our future webinar on administrative actions and agency updates. But of note in the appropriations bills, for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, that authorized COVID-19 testing to be covered by Medicaid and provided funds for Medicaid coverage of coronavirus testing for the uninsured. However, not all immigrants are eligible for Medicaid. Only, quote unquote, qualified immigrants are eligible, and this can include, such as lawful permanent residents with more than 5 years on that status, asylees, refugees. And so Stimulus 3.5, if you skip ahead, also provided funds for the same Medicaid coverage and did not alter that qualifying criteria. So, another kind of example of this is in the CARES Act. There's some limitations on both the stimulus checks and the pandemic unemployment assistance that apply to immigrant communities. So for the stimulus checks, they require a social security number rather than an individual taxpayer identification number, or ITIN, which is commonly used by undocumented immigrants. instead of a social security number. So it excludes, it has the effect of excluding undocumented immigrants, their spouses, and their children from stimulus checks. So that's $1,200 per spouse and $500 per child. And that is unless they filed taxes separately, which is generally not the case. The legislation makes an exception for military families, allowing cash payments to those with, social security numbers, even if their spouse has an ITIN. It's worth noting that separate lawsuits from spouses and children of undocumented immigrants have been filed against the administration and are sort of developing. The pandemic unemployment assistance, which I think many folks are aware of at this point, it provides relief for unemployed workers who are ineligible for their state unemployment insurance or have run out of state benefits. And this includes, under the CARES Act, the self-employed. So that's, gig workers and freelancers, for example, but importantly, it does not include unauthorized workers. So the PUA recipients must be currently work authorized and have been authorized when employed. So it's worth, we can't speculate too much about stimulus 4, except for what we've kind of been hearing. Advocates are certainly asking that these technicalities be addressed in the next stimulus. And on the other hand, the president and his advisors have intimated that the president might support increased aid to state and local governments, as Susan covered and touched on. But that might be in exchange for compliance with certain administration priorities, including those related to sanctuary cities. So we can't really provide a whole lot of detailed information on that at this time, but that's a sentiment that's been kind of repeated from the White House. I guess it's worth mentioning that, there are ways that immigrant communities can access care under the CARES Act. So community health centers, which provide care regardless of immigration status, receive $2 billion in additional funding under the CARES Act. Federal health centers, including community health centers, were allocated $825 million under Stimulus 3.5. This isn't all CARES Act, that was Stimulus 3.5. And then the federal paid sick and family leave provisions do not have any immigration requirements as well. So, certainly not ideal, but that's kind of like the fuller picture. If we could advance to the next slide. These are additional resources, and I think that we're providing most of these in the chat box as well. I'm not sure that folks can actually click on them. And our contact on the final slide is for Susan and I, if you'd like to be in touch after the briefing. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucia. Susan, to answer Lucia's sort of last question before we jump into questions, you can't click on the PowerPoint slide to access the links, but the chat box, we have been dropping those in as well as their contact information, so you can pull them from there, and they'll also be available on the resources page after that. We've got a couple questions before we leave for today. Susan or maybe Lucia, can you explain why the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act is not considering Stimulus 4?
I can take
it.
Yeah, you want to do it, Lucia, or you want me to?
No, you're good.
Okay, so I think the reason for that is because there's been two slices of pie, if you will, that deal with paycheck protection. There was paycheck protection in the CARES Act, and then what we call CARES Act 3.5 or Stimulus 3.5. There was another slice for paycheck protection almost exclusively that was in the 3.5 stimulus bill that was just done a week or two ago. So I don't know if there will be any more motivation on the part of Congress, given that there's all these other buckets that were not addressed in 3.5 going forward into the fourth stimulus that they feel maybe need to be addressed in the fourth stimulus. I will say there is, we have heard from some of the states that and it's a question, whether you can use your stimulus money under the Coronavirus Relief Fund to help businesses who have struggled during the coronavirus epidemic. And you'll remember that I said that stimulus funding cannot be retroactive. It can only be proactive or forward-looking and address specific coronavirus expenses or expenses that were incurred as a result of the pandemic. The question that we would raise with Treasury is, would that be considered an expense arising from coronavirus to help businesses that have suffered as a result of having to close down? This would not be a loan. This would be, here's your money. Could states then appropriate that or create a grant fund of some sort at the state level using those federal funds? So that's something that states are looking at doing. Probably need to get clarification from the Department of Treasury before actually going forward with that. But it is something that some states have looked to consider.
Thanks, Susan. Lucia, this one's for you. Is there a state share requirement under emergency management performance grants? 50% is the current share under FY20.
That's a good question, and I want to say no, but I'm happy to follow up just to be sure.
Absolutely, and Liz Evans will make sure to get in touch with you as well as share that information on our website. Susan, can you talk a little bit what has a better chance of passage on a bipartisan basis? More money in state aid or flexibility for states with CARES Act funding to permit states to address revenue loss in their budgets?
I think the less controversial of the two is the flexibility piece, because, like I mentioned, there are so many other buckets that I think Congress is seeking to fill. Obviously, state and local aid is also one of those buckets, but I think our ask for flexibility in funds that have already been dispersed through the Coronavirus Relief Fund in the CARES Act is the less controversial of the two.
Thanks. And I will end with one more if we don't have any other participant questions coming in. Can you just explain what's next? What's the timeline for the next stimulus package? I know there's no crystal ball on what this is, but Susan, how do you foresee the next timeline mapping out?
Negotiations are ongoing now, so I think that our best guesstimate would be more toward the end of May. And I think the House has to come back, first of all. They can't vote unless they're here. They will probably release their bill at some point next week, probably more toward the end of next week. The Senate will then take a look at that and begin the negotiations back and forth between the two chambers. I know that the House wants to be the first one out of the box with the legislation, so they're going to move more quickly. But I don't anticipate final passage to be much before the 3rd or 4th week of May.
Thanks, Susan. We'll stop there for today. As a reminder, the PowerPoint and some of the resources are currently available on the resource page of our website. And I believe it'll be put in the chat box one more time. There you go. We'll be adding to that page with recordings. And we are working on sending out from both last time and this time blast to all the registered participants to make sure you're aware of the follow-up information and get questions addressed. Know that we are still on that if you're waiting for a reply from last week, and this week we will be sure to get in touch with you shortly. I'd like to thank Susan and Lucia for their insightful presentations today. Shout out to the rest of the NCSL team for their tireless effort to produce this meeting. It's sort of our first go around with virtual meetings. So I thank the team effort for this, and I hope that you as participants are enjoying it. Feel free to reach out to myself or anyone else if you have suggestions or ideas for other meetings. We're new at this, so we welcome any feedback you'd like to provide. And I hope you will join us next week for our virtual meeting on juvenile justice responses to COVID-19. We'll be joined by Judge Stephen Teskey from Clayton County, Georgia, Heidi Mueller, who's the director of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, and Dana Schoenberg from the Pew Charitable Trust Public Safety Performance Project. Should prove to be a very interesting session that time. And until then, I hope you stay safe as you navigate through these unprecedented times. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.